do, that the problem of what to do about immigrants coming here from the South is apparently something that needs to be dealt with. I would deal with it by trying to educate people about why it isn't a problem, or about what is not a problem about it, and trying to make people understand that it isn't hurting anything particularly, and or fixing the structural problems that maybe make it create difficulties in some things, like wage situations where people are coming in and taking jobs at lower wages than resident workers are willing or able to take. I mean, if you have no job, a lower wage is better than no wage, but the problem of people trying to continually pay less for things is a real problem. So you could, for example, solve some of these wage problems that are created by workers coming in and being willing to take lower wages by having say a national minimum wage that was high enough that the lowest wage that someone could pay was still high enough for everybody to survive on, and then you wouldn't have people saying, well, I'll work for less than that, because that is the legal low-end limit. So you would solve that problem in one way, for example. That would be a way of dealing with wage suppression that can result from unskilled workers coming here. You just make unskilled jobs have a decent enough pay that the person who's doing the hiring is going to pick someone with better credentials or a history or whatever than someone who doesn't. And then that makes it harder for someone to come here and take lower wages. You could, of course, help some of these countries resolve some of the problems that cause people to come here, or you could even help them by maybe not causing the problems in the first place to the extent that they are being created by us. But again, we were not going to go there, so I'm going to avoid that topic. So anyway, I do want to briefly comment on the children that have died in U.S. custody, because that's an important thing that has happened this year that will alter the way we do business going forward, I'm sure, and I hope. So the title of this story is Guatemalan Boy 8 Dies in Immigration Custody After Being Diagnosed with a Cold. The official cause of the child's death is still unknown, and CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility will conduct a review. So an 8-year-old Guatemalan boy died of unknown causes in the custody of U.S. Customs and Border Protection minutes before midnight on Christmas Eve in New Mexico, the agency said in a statement Tuesday. A Border Patrol agent noted that the child, who was apprehended with his father, showed signs of potential illness on Monday, CBP said, citing initial reporting. The father and son were then taken to a medical center in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where the child was initially diagnosed with a common cold, according to the statement. When the boy was evaluated for release, hospital staff found a fever and he was held for an additional 90 minutes before being released on Monday afternoon. The boy was given prescriptions for amoxicillin, an antibiotic, and the painkiller ibuprofen. On Monday night, the boy was nauseous and began vomiting and was sent back to the same hospital but lost consciousness en route. Hospital staff were unable to resuscitate the boy and pronounced him dead at 11:48 p.m. on Christmas Eve, the agency said in an updated statement late Tuesday. CBP had previously said the boy died early on Christmas Day. This is a tragic loss. On behalf of U.S. and Customs Border Protection, our deepest sympathies go out to the family, said Commissioner Kevin McAleen in a statement. The boy's father was being detained late Tuesday at the Alamogordo station pending transfer to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He has spoken to his spouse in Guatemala and the Guatemalan consulate, the agency said. Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, the incoming chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, identified the boy as Felipe Alonso Gomez in a statement Tuesday. Castro credited CBP for its timely public notification, but he also blamed the Trump administration's broader immigration policy for putting migrants in harm's way. Quote, the administration's policy of turning people away from legal ports of entry, otherwise known as metering, is putting families and children in great danger, Castro said in a statement. The official cause of the child's death is still unknown, and CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility will conduct a review consistent with policy, according to the statement. The hospital where the boy died, the General Champion Regional Medical Center, said privacy regulations prevented it from sharing information about any individual patient. Our thoughts and prayers are with this family during this very difficult time, the medical center said. The boy's death comes after Jacqueline Gael Maquin, 7, also of Guatemala, died in Border Patrol custody earlier this month. Her body arrived in Guatemala on Monday. Her death sparked outrage and calls for an independent investigation. CBP announced last week that it would begin informing Congress and the media within 24 hours after someone dies in its custody. The American Civil Liberties Union said in a tweet Tuesday that the boy's death was a horrific tragedy and that CBP should be held accountable. The group called for the incoming Congress to investigate the Department of Homeland Security, which includes CBP. Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington called the boy's death deplorable. What happened to one death is too many, she said, quoting Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen's testimony before the House Judicial Committee last week following Jacqueline's death. So that's the news as of now that we have on that, and that's another story ending 2018 that really kind of puts into focus a lot of what's going on, because you hear these things. Okay, so from that story, it sounds like, these are from official statements, it sounds like, oh, well, we noticed that the boy was ill, sent him to the hospital. The hospital said, oh, well, he's not that sick, let's send him home. They sent him home, not home, but back to jail. He comes back and he's dead. So whose fault? Well, gosh, it's not ours because, we sent him to the hospital. The hospital says, well, it's not our fault. We didn't know what was wrong with him and he seemed okay to us. Everybody is just kind of pushing it off. If this was your child, however, that would not be okay. These statements would not hold any weight with you at all. And the fact that these are considered adequate under these circumstances says a lot about how the government generally feels about the people that they're working with when they're dealing with undocumented persons coming here. They are, we've had, I won't even bother to look up the quotes specifically, but we've had people blame it on the immigrants, like, well, it's their fault for undertaking this dangerous journey. If they just stayed at home, they wouldn't have this problem. It's not our fault. We didn't do anything to them. You have Trump saying that, oh, it's Democrats' fault because they're holding out false promises of something. I don't know what. Somehow Democrats are getting the message to people in Central and South America that hey, it's okay to come here and everything will be just fine. And then they find out that it isn't. And, gosh, if only they'd told them that they were unwelcome like we are, then they would have stayed home, which again is not true because they know that there's a problem coming here, but they're coming here anyway because they need to. Let's just put it as simply as possible. You don't pack up, I don't know how many times I've said this on this show, but you really do not pack up everything and just strike out blindly to a country you've never been to in hopes of finding something there for yourself, work, a place to live, whatever. You don't do that unless you're desperate. You don't cross deserts. You don't pay people to hide you in the back of a truck to cross the border. You don't do any of those things unless you're pretty desperate. It is not the promise of free goodies that are bringing people here, contrary to the way it's been described. It's the hope of something that is better than what you've got that is bringing people here. So if the trip is that dangerous and that awful, that's considered better than where they're coming from. And that tells you something about where they're coming from. So even if you utterly dismiss the notion that we have any responsibility for helping to create the conditions that these people are fleeing from, you can't, as a humanitarian, dismiss the fact that they are fleeing from these conditions and that the desperation of their flight is evidence of its seriousness. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say that if you do dismiss the notion that we are somehow responsible for helping to create the conditions that these people are fleeing from, then what you have are people that are innocent in every way. They're innocently running away from danger. Why is there danger? Well, I don't know. Apparently, if all the notions that we've put forth in previous shows don't carry any weight for you, and your assumption is that they're not true, we don't know why situations are terrible. Maybe it's bad politics down there. Maybe it's people shouldn't live in these places. You remember the comedian back in the 80s? Was it I can't think of his name, the guy that screamed all the time, who was talking about, people starving in Africa, and he was saying, well, don't send them food. Tell them to move to where the food is. Like that was a solution that no one had thought of. Like, oh gosh, I'm sitting here starving, and it never occurred to me to just pack up and move someplace where there was food. I just never thought of that. That was the most dismissive, bigoted, it was just awful. Oh, Sam Kinison. Yeah, it was just awful joke. But that seems to be the notion that a lot of people in this country have. That kind of thinking is the notion that they have. It's like, well, if things are terrible where you are, go somewhere else. Only not here. Don't come here because we don't want you here. Why? Well, because you're bringing drugs, or it's like it's this weird, convoluted logic that doesn't make any sense. If they're supposed to get away from a terrible place that they're in, then they have to get away to somewhere else. And this is somewhere else. So by all rights, by the Sam Kinison law, as expressed back in the 80s, if you're starving, if you're dealing with gang violence and all those things, and it's terrible, go to where that stuff isn't. This is where that stuff isn't. We have our own problems here, but they're not as bad as the ones that they have down there. So this is where they should come. But, oh no, we don't want them. So you create a problem, and I don't know whether they're supposed to go to Canada. They're just supposed to get on a boat and go around the U.S. and go to Canada, or I don't know what people are thinking, or just supposed to stay there and just deal with it, I guess. I'm not sure, but the anti-immigrant logic escapes me, and it's difficult for me to even explain it a lot of the time, even for the sake of arguing with it. All I can say is I argue with your conclusion. I utterly disagree with your conclusion. Even though I can't always put your thinking into any kind of coherent sense so that I can discuss it properly. But anyway, so I have a couple of stories left that I wanted to read. I'm not sure. I'm going to switch gears here. We've been talking about immigration in the U.S., but it's not the only place in the world where there are problems with immigration. I mean, basically right now, there are a lot of people who are fleeing war, they're fleeing famine, they're fleeing all sorts of things, and they're trying to find somewhere to go. So migration, immigration, refugees coming, These are problems in a lot of different places, and they're being dealt with in a lot of different ways. And so I thought I would read this article because I thought it was interesting. And it's entitled Japan's Denial of Immigration Reality Echoes Germany's Experience with Guest Workers. And it reads as follows. The recent sweeping revision to the immigration law opens a gateway for as many as 345,000 migrant workers to enter Japan in the next 5 years. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, however, has repeatedly said the new visa system does not constitute an immigration policy. Quote, this system is needed for talented foreign personnel to play bigger roles in Japan amid the nationwide labor shortage, Abe said in justifying the revision at a December 10th news conference. We will clearly present a cap for the numbers and time frame for acceptance. This is not an immigration policy. Experts say, however, what his denial represents is much more than the Abe administration's attitude toward immigration. Rather, they say, it epitomizes the contradictory realities surrounding it. Even though the government is essentially in denial of their existence, Japan has already brought in hundreds of thousands of immigrants, and the ratio of long-term foreign residents is expected to keep rising. Akihiro Koido, a sociology professor who studies immigration policies at Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, said the law is an immigration policy regardless of Abe's staunch denial. Koido compared the current state of immigration policy in Japan to Germany's Gastarbeiters, the guest workers adopted in the 1950s to boost its war-ravaged economy. When Germany concluded a labor treaty with its neighbors, Koido said, the premise was that it would receive migrant workers only on a temporary basis. Back then, Germany denied that those guest workers were immigrants, he said. In reality, though, Germany had to change its interpretation of immigrants after having accepted many of them. Koido explains that when Germany announced it would terminate the system in the 1970s, many feared they wouldn't be able to enter the country again, which actually encouraged them to stay and have families, accelerating the growth of long-term settlers. Before that, the foreign population in Germany had already jumped from 686,000 in 1961 to 1.8 million in 1967, according to the Japan Institute for Labor Policy and Training. Germany eventually enacted a law in 2005 that focused on long-term residency and integration, reducing the number of residency types to 2 and specifying that applicants must learn the German language and culture as an important part of the process. The 2005 law is deemed significant in that it declared Germany as a country of immigrants half a century after the introduction of the Gastarbeiter. Gastarbeiter. Japan is actually following the early German policy that was unwilling to acknowledge Gastarbeiters, that's a weird word, as immigrants, instead of devising more contemporary, progressive, and effective policies, Koido said. During Diet deliberations, Abe kept insisting that the revision would not open the door for immigrants to settle in Japan permanently. The revised immigration law, however, will introduce 2 new types of working visas, one valid up to 5 years and the other renewable indefinitely with a legal employment contract. Those in the first category cannot bring their families with them. Those in the second category, which the government describes as for people with higher skills, are able to bring their families. We are not thinking about adopting a policy that will accept a certain number of foreigners with their dependents indefinitely to sustain the country's population, Abe said last year. Political analysts have speculated Abe's refusal to say the I word is an effort to appease the part of his conservative base that's skeptical of immigration, even though that stance puts him at odds with the party that desperately needs it, the business community. Koido said the government, even before the current administration, has been reluctant to acknowledge Japan was hosting immigrants. He cited 1990s immigration reform that widened the legal status for those seeking work and made it easier for foreign people, particularly those of Japanese descent, to come to Japan for work. The government at that time also refused to characterize the reform as immigration policy. Quote, the Japanese government hasn't actively defined immigration policy, but that doesn't mean the country didn't have immigrants in the 90s, Koido said. The logic that long-term residents are not immigrants doesn't make sense. Even though Japan didn't automatically become a country of immigrants, an immigration policy essentially existed around that time. The central government's reluctance in acknowledging immigration shifted the strains of developing integration policies to the municipalities, Koido said. Excuse me. Yasumoto Suzuki, the mayor of Hamamatsu, Shizuoka Prefecture, where about 20,000 foreign residents make a living, stressed that municipalities have proactively sought to accommodate immigrants. The Diet's tug of war over the use of the term is out of touch with reality, Suzuki said. Justice Ministry data showed that 29% of all 2.56 million non-Japanese residing here with legal status, about 749,000 people, were permanent residents as of the end of 2017. In 1997, only about 82,000 out of about 1.48 million people were permanent residents. So this is a very different situation from what's going on in the U.S. right now, even though it has some interesting similarities. I mean, Japan is apparently really needing people to come and work. They're having a labor shortage for certain kinds of jobs. It's an aging population. There aren't as many young people being born. And so there is a need for people to come in and do this kind of work that is no longer being performed by people who are too old to do it, or unborn people that don't exist to do it. So they need to attract people, and they are aware of it, and they are making efforts to attract people and to make it possible for people to come there. But at the same time, they're trying very hard not to say, oh, well, we're inviting you to come live here and become Japanese with us, because there are apparently problems with that idea. And as in many countries around the world, the word immigration really sets off alarm bells and makes people get all tense, and they start thinking, oh, I don't like that. So here in the U.S., we have less of a labor problem, except in certain industries. Excuse me. Agriculture, for example, it's a big problem. Basically a lot of industries related to agriculture all require a lot of human labor, and they have trouble getting people to do that kind of work. So they need, in many instances, to bring in immigrants to do that sort of work because there are just not enough people here who want to do it, or are able to do it, or are willing to do it, or however you want to look at it. I'm not sure what the statistics are exactly, because I don't know that anyone has ever gone out and asked everybody why they do or don't take a certain kind of job. But even so, basically the theme here is we don't want you here at all. And the Trump administration is actively busy trying to keep immigrants down, to lock out, shut out, remove people who have come here in some instances. We haven't even gotten into that part yet. And basically cut down on people coming here, again, based around the loaded qualities of that word immigrant and what that means to people when they hear it, and how they feel about that idea of others coming here to live with us. Foreign workers, guest workers, all those things sound more, less threatening, I guess you might say, to people who are like, well, we like this to be our country and for things to be run our way and our culture to predominate, our language to be the common one, and all those kinds of things. People prefer that idea, and even in places like Japan, for example, where they're actively trying to get people to come, they're still wanting to maintain this notion, I would argue a fiction, that by someone coming there and living for years and working, that they haven't actually immigrated there. Like they're just, like it's a really long vacation. But I don't know about you, but even at my age, 5 years is a long time. If I were to go somewhere for 5 years, I would pretty much feel like I'd moved there. You know, it wouldn't be this sense of like, oh, I'm just here for a while, then I'm going to go away and go somewhere else. I mean, 5 years is a long time. And if you make visas that are renewable indefinitely, that's pretty much, you're living there. You've moved there. That's your new home. And so you have immigrated or emigrated, however you want to, is it emigrate? Emigrate is to leave. Immigrate is, okay. You've immigrated to that country, and that's where you are pretty much intending to stay. You're putting down roots. So saying that it's a guest worker program it's kind of just playing with words, I think. It's not admitting what's really going on. And so anyway, I just brought that up because I thought it would be interesting. We talk about what's going on here a lot, and we're very U.S. focused in our conversation, in our news and things, but it is also interesting to look at Europe and Asia and other places around the world and see how they're dealing with their own problems when it comes to assimilating people from the outside. It's funny how ideas, how fads, how music, how arts, how goods and services, how so many things are just flying around the world in every direction without a problem. Nobody minds that. But when it comes to people coming there, suddenly it's a different issue. Everybody wants to go out and eat in a Mexican restaurant here in the U.S., but for some reason, a lot of people don't want Mexicans to come here. Who's cooking their Mexican food? I don't know. But it's apparently that's kind of beside the point. That, they want, fellow Americans cooking Mexican food or something. I don't know what it is, but it's just interesting how the things we accept gladly from other places and we embrace, and we even go out and looking for them. And then the things that we're suddenly, when it's people, it's a different story. Suddenly it's a terrible thing. We can't have it. We don't want it here. So I think it would behoove all of us to step back a little bit and think about this as we enter a new year here and start looking for how we're going to proceed in the future. Let's think a little bit about what we are and aren't accepting and why, and try to come to some sort of reasonable accommodation for the needs of a global society. Because let's face it, the world is getting smaller as the ability to travel increases, as networking increases, as the internet reaches more places and cell phones go everywhere. We're contacting each other. We're rubbing up against each other in all sorts of ways and absorbing all sorts of things from each other. And it shouldn't be so shocking that some of those things are actual people bringing things with them. So anyway, if you're listening live, I hope you have a good New Year coming up. It's New Year's Eve, and I hope you're doing something fun or celebratory in some way. And if you're watching this on TV or whatever, it's already happened. It's 2019, and we'll have a lot more ahead in the future. So we'll see you later. Bye-bye.